Hey y'all, my name is Samantha Ali, and I'm one of the Associate Shorts Programmers for Doc NYC. I'm very pleased to lead the Q&A for Speak Up, Stand Up Shorts program at Doc NYC 2020. I'll ask everyone to introduce themselves as well as their relationship to the film. Let's start with you, Dia.
Hi, I'm Dia Sokol Savage. I directed Welcome Strangers, and I immediately forgot if there's something else I'm supposed to say to introduce myself, but I'm so happy to be here and very grateful to Doc NYC for showing the film.
That's perfect. Awesome. Sam, why don't we go to you?
Sure. My name is Samantha Knowles. I directed Tangled Roots.
Who wants to go next? Monica, let's go with you.
Hi everyone, I'm Monica Wise. I'm the director of Lupita, and I'm also excited to be here.
Anjali?
Hi, my name is Anjali Nayar. I'm the director of Oil and Water. Very excited to be here with you all.
Hi, I'm Samuel Douek. I am the director of Stonewall 2069, coming to you from London. So thank you very much for inviting me to be here and to be part of Doc NYC.
We're so happy all of you could be here, and thank you for sharing your stories with us. I want to get right into, obviously, the tried and true question. What was the inspiration for your film? Samuel, let's start with you.
So last year, I decided to make Stonewall 2069 in honor of the 50th anniversary of the 1969 Stonewall riots, which was 3 days of rioting, which triggered the gay liberation movement. And I'm really interested in sci-fi and queer theory and LGBTQ history. So I kind of wanted to honor this anniversary by looking 50 years into the future and inviting different theorists, artists, and scientists to speculate on what the year 2069 might look like for queer identity and for activism. And it was a combination between sort of gathered documentary interviews and more staged artistic performance that played with animation and movement. So it was kind of like a docu-fantasy exploration into the queer future.
I love it. Monica, what about you? What inspired your film?
Hi. I was looking for a story around the first woman to campaign for presidency, Indigenous woman to campaign for presidency in the fall of 2017. So that's 3 years ago now, in Chiapas, Mexico, in the Zapatista Caracoles. I wanted to know like what was behind that espectaculo, and I saw Lupita speak, and she really impacted all of the journalists, all the filmmakers, everyone there. I saw someone that stood out with her voice and the weight of her family and her history. And I tried to get her to know her better. And 3 years later, we have a collaboration of her and Lalo from the community, and 3 years for 20 minutes.
We definitely feel it. Sam, what about you? What inspired Tangled Roots?
So I had wanted to make a film about Black hair discrimination for a few years. When I was 15 and at a Catholic school in upstate New York, I found a rule in my school's handbook that said that men couldn't have cornrows or dreadlocks. And I remember all the way back then, you know, that was like 15 years ago now, I was just struck by it. It felt like discrimination to me, but it wasn't labeled that back then. And so I had the potential opportunity to make a film, and I stumbled across Attica Scott, who was the only Black woman representative in the state of Kentucky. And she was fighting for a bill that would ban the type of discrimination that my school's rule sort of represented. So I was just really struck by her and her dynamism, and I just kind of set out to make a film about her.
Very relevant to today, and we're going to get into it in just a little bit. Anjali, what about you? What inspired Oil and Water?
Yeah, sure. The reality is that this type of situation where communities are living on the front lines of big business happens everywhere in the world. and that, you know, extraction by shape or form is seen as a kind of cure-all for the lack of government and services, whether you're talking about Foxconn in the US or you're talking about Tullow Oil in northern Kenya. So things like water or education or healthcare, anything like that, it's seen as like a way to develop, and that it's the only course to happen. I've been working in the Turkana region, which is northern Kenya, since 2006, roughly. And I saw the kind of coming in of Tullow Oil and what had happened to communities afterwards, and had always wanted to do something about it. But in particular, this community was so special, and why I wanted to tell this story was that we often see these narratives of community versus business from the lens of men, because they tend to have the voice in communities, and to like take a step back and look at why, like what role women play in those communities in terms of taking care of children, taking care of food, taking care of the welfare of communities, how much more important it was to have a voice in their community than to have a voice with the company, and what was really holding them back in that kind of path towards sustainable development.
Thank you. Dia, finally.
I was inspired to make this film because of what was happening in the summer of 2018, which is when the Trump administration put the zero tolerance policy into effect at the border. And so everything I was reading and hearing about and feeling helpless about was about, you know, these families being separated. And I was, as soon as I heard about Casa de Paz and the work that they were doing, I hadn't, you know, I'd been so focused on this sort of frontline drama and, you know, horrendous behaviors that I had really not even taken a minute to think about what's happening to people who are legally here, following the law, in that first moment when they get released from immigrant detention. And so I was so drawn to what they are doing, and it felt like this beautiful kind of, you know, shining light amidst a lot of misery and chaos. So I just loved it. And then as soon as I went to the casa and I met Sarah and Oliver, I realized like there's something really special here, and I wanted to capture that, because it was a time when I didn't feel like there was very much hope. So I love that through their small acts of kindness, they were really changing things and making things better.
Totally, and all of your films kind of have that tone of, you know, social justice and empowerment and all these different movements. Monica, I want to talk to you about Lupita. Your film was quite poetic, and I was wondering what the assembly process was like, because I sense that either you were the editor or you had a great relationship with your editor. So what was that assembly process like for you?
It was difficult. We actually, for like a year with my first editor, we had like a rough cut that I wasn't convinced by. I had a lot of scenes that I felt were poetic and kind of spoke to what I wanted to show, but there wasn't something that like tied it all together, because I needed to be understandable to an international audience because it's going on The Guardian, but I also wanted to be from like a feminine, sensitive eye, to understand Lupita's reality. So it was hard to find that balance, and I eventually ended up bringing on Mar Jardiel, our finishing editor, who kind of reassembled everything and recut the intro, which really helped, I think, with the Super 8. I also wondered how to put her memories of the massacre. It was I didn't want to do anything literal. I thought about open spaces, and I think the Super 8 helped, especially because her whole community always feels like they're trapped in that past. So it gives something a little bit more tangible and creative, and so yeah, that's how it turned out. Well, it was a long process.
It definitely was. And I think your finishing editor did an excellent job, because your film is quite lyrical. And as I mentioned earlier, poetic, and congratulations on that.
That's great to hear, thanks.
Dia, I want to talk to you more about Welcome Stranger. How did you navigate documenting folks in such precarious situations without endangering them? Obviously, I noticed at the end of the film, the title sequence, we only have one last name and everybody else is only first name. So can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, definitely the biggest challenge of this film was how to respect the experience of the guests at the casa, these immigrants who'd just been released and been through all kinds of trauma, beginning from, fleeing their home countries and seeking asylum. So we had a lot of different safety guards in place. We had translators on hand to try to, to ask from the very beginning if people were comfortable. We repeatedly checked in with people. It was hard because the process for people when they get released, they're, alone in a city, they don't know anybody, and then they sort of have to trust these strangers and they get in a car with them, and it's just so disorienting. And so we also didn't want to just assume that their consent, because they said at the beginning, sure, you can film, was, that we checked in again and again and explained what we were doing. And it, sort of during the time that they were there, you would see them settle into being at the casa and realizing these are friends and people are helping them get to the airport or to their, arranged pickups. And it was, so we did a lot of just checking in throughout the time that we were shooting. And then we also consulted with immigration attorneys during the editing process, because we wanted to make sure that we weren't putting anything in the film that was going to complicate their cases or, endanger them, both while they're in the United States or people who were back home. So we were careful about how we identified them. We just tried to sort of cover our bases as much as possible and do our best. And then, we didn't use last names. While we were filming, we were really cautious also about, we didn't use Oliver's wife's name. I wouldn't even text it to him or say it. We were really trying to be very, very careful in that way. And we also had to be mindful, the casa is just a house in a suburban neighborhood. And so we also didn't want to create any issues for the neighbors. So we weren't some huge, company rolling in with big trucks and taking over. We really tried to have a very light touch so that we didn't draw any unwanted attention to them, so that they can continue their work.
There was actually one point in the film that I wanted to talk to you about, where one person was sitting in the front of the car and one of the volunteers left to find other arrivals. And it was quite a tense moment where you feel the nervousness of that person who wants to trust that Casa de Paz is a real place. And so I was wondering what it was like to capture that moment and how important it was for you to keep that in the final cut.
Yeah, I mean, when I set out to make this film, I really wanted to capture just the uncertainty and the fear that people are experiencing. And I wasn't sure if I would do it. I've been at the casa on nights when nobody gets released. I've been there when, heard stories of people running down the street with volunteers saying, no, I'm trying to help you. I'll give you a ride to wherever you need to go. So we really didn't know what we were going to get. And that's actually that moment in the car, which ended up being such a tense and pivotal, I think it just really gives you insight into what what Javier is going through. I wasn't in the car. So because we were trying to have a very light footprint, I was in a different vehicle waiting. And, that's just one of those moments when you're so grateful to have an amazing team. And I've worked with the same cinematographer, Matthias Grunski, for my entire career on every feature film I've done, and my TV show, everything. And so he was just there and he caught that moment. And, you can't really tell whether or not those people are taking him back to immigrant detention or if they mean what they say. So it was truly just one of those, the film God smiled upon us.
They clearly know what they're doing. So you need to keep working with that person. Amazing cinematography in that moment. I kind of want to switch gears to Tangled Roots. Samantha, Kentucky obviously has received international attention after the killing of Breonna Taylor. I was wondering what Attica Scott is up to today, especially being the only Black woman present on the state legislation.
Yes, well, true to her form, Attica is both fighting in the streets and in the state legislature. So she and her daughter Ashanti, you also saw in the film, they are out protesting loudly. They were recently arrested and received felony charges, which were later dropped. But that was a big fight. And at the same time, she's at the helm of Breonna's law, which would ban no-knock warrants. So it's been, you know, and she's incredibly busy, and so I check in with her as I can, and I ask her, how can I help amplify, you know, what she's doing, but she's sticking to, you know, everything she's kind of done throughout her career. And she's incredible. She's the real deal. So she's just fighting.
And how did you meet Attica? Like, what event did y'all connect at and you were like, this is my next character?
It was really luck. I was looking for a story, and it never happens like that. But I wanted to tell a story about hair discrimination. I wanted somebody who was going to make it seem real, because even when I say it now, I can't believe that it's a term that people use that is being legislated across the country. And I just found this op-ed that Ashanti, her daughter, had written about her mom. And basically it was mostly about their fight at Ashanti's high school, where they fought to have this discriminatory hair rule that said you can't have braids and twists, etc. They fought to have that banned. And at the end, she said, my mom, who happens to be a state representative, is fighting to pass a bill that would ban this statewide. And I was like, wait a minute, that's an active story. You know, that's a great, for a documentary filmmaker, that's something that's gold. And then I just started learning more and more about Attica, and I just cold emailed her and was like, I have to make a film about you. You're amazing. And luckily she was incredibly receptive.
I love that. Everyone always has like, it happened by luck story. So I'm glad I asked you about yours. Samuel, I kind of want to switch gears to you, Stonewall 2069. Talk to us about, you know, more about queer theory and queer futurism specifically. I'm really interested in that, and how this film conceptualizes the 100th anniversary of Stonewall.
Sure. So I didn't really have any agenda sort of going into making this film, which is felt quite uncomfortable for me in a way, because I come from a documentary and a music video investigated, and with this film we just threw the net out there and see what would come back. And so it was more learning for me. It was an education really in what the future might be. And the thing that kind of struck up the most, that was the most sort of common finding from all the theorists and sort of speculative research we did, was the idea of transhumanism, whereby technology is integrated into your biology to improve, you know, daily functions. And we already have a lot of transhuman tech in our day-to-day lives today with things like a hearing aid. So it's basically the next inevitable step in our technology. And I think that has a very interesting relation to the understanding of queerness, because queerness is so often defined by physicality, by transitioning between genders or fluidity, and separating sexuality from gender identity. So how you modify your body, how you choose to step into the future, I think really resonates with an idea of queerness. And there's a nice quote in the film, which is that transhumanism is the queer frontier. And I think that really resonated with me. And the film kind of made itself in a way. It was a very experimental way of filmmaking, one that feels disjointed maybe at times, but one that felt like it really represented like a quite anarchic view of filmmaking, when I felt that was really appropriate to the genre. And in terms of what the 100th anniversary of Stonewall 1969 will look like, that's kind of what I really wanted to explore. And it's why for more performative side of the film, we cast a Black trans woman, because the Stonewall riots were started by people of color, by women, by trans women. And that's something that's often disregarded by like a whitewashing of history. So I wanted to recognize that with the casting and with future activism. And Yeah, so it was very much like an exploration of what the future could be through a very contemporary lens, and yeah, hopefully it honors, you know, queer history in a meaningful way.
I must commend you because it was definitely quite dynamic of a film and very vivid. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm very interested in futurisms and all types of futurisms. And so to see your film, it was very inspirational about what people can create with the simple idea of like, what does this look like in at the 100th anniversary? What does this look like at the 150th and so on? So congratulations. I genuinely think it was a beautiful film. I want to switch gears to oil and water. Anjali, this particular story hits very close to home for me as I have family in Kenya. And I wanted to know what the status of the women's movement is today and potentially progress that they've made.
Sure. Well, it's an interesting situation because, as with most things, global politics and economics often has more of an influence on than local kind of situations on the ground. So because of number one, the change in oil prices and the drop in oil prices over 2020, as well as kind of the coronavirus and all the economics related to that, originally Tullow Oil was trying to sell a good portion of its work to raise money, like it was having financial troubles. And so that's a bit on a pause because they weren't able to sell that portion of the company, and they were able to negotiate, which is unfortunate again, better tax breaks and other subsidies again from the Kenyan government. So they're going forward, and it's not entirely clear how that will kind of play out in the months to come, but that's kind of the current status. In terms of the women's movement, you know, very much the last line of the film was about how long it takes to change opinions, to change the structures, and not only to get a woman like Chum Chum, who's an elder, to be able to speak out in that environment, but also younger women who often have a much harder time to raise their voice and be a participant in kind of community interactions. So that's still an ongoing challenge. That's not something that's going to be resolved in a year or 2 years. It's going to be decades. But every single subsequent generation is taking their own understanding of what that is, especially with the access to knowledge and the internet and everything else, being able to be a participant in all of these conversations. So to that extent, there's a couple of organizations like Friends of Lake Turkana and the Kenyan Land Alliance that are doing a lot of work with those women on a continued basis and will continue to fight Tullow Oil. But for all intents and purposes, you know, the Kenyan government and other partners are continuing to build the oil pipeline eventually and continuing to explore and extract oil throughout the region, as well as build in the National Heritage Site, the Lamu area, a massive port.
At this point, it's like, at what cost? And we already see the cost of human life that's happening on the ground there, but what were some of the lessons that you learned in, you know, Kenya that is very similar to what's happening here in the United States with respects to local on the ground movements versus, you know, big corporations?
Yeah, I think it's even, you know, I've been looking at these types of issues for a really long time, and it often feels like an unending battle. You know, you win, it's one of those like whack-a-mole games where you like hit down something and then something else grows up in its place. I actually don't see a lot of difference between the kinds of experiences that are being like in, I think it's Minnesota with Foxconn here in the States, and, you know, this promise or this ideal of development being what can save people or create opportunities, and it never really turns out that way. I think more so what I've seen is just like this entire 2020 year has been a moment of pause for everybody, and in as much as it's making us look at, you know, our values and the systems that we want to create in the future and kind of thinking about how we want to rebuild them. I think very much it's the case in Kenya right now with like, how do we take a step forward and build structures that are like not only durable, but sustainable into the future, and have the voices of those people on the ground as the primary kind of decision makers. I think that that's what's most important moving forward.
Thank you. My final question for all of you folks is, you know, what are you working on now? What can we see next from you? Anjali, let's start with you.
I'm making a film with my very good friends and super talented artist, Just a Band in Kenya. It's about an Afro-electric pop group that wants to go to space.
That is so cool. Oh, I can't wait to see that. Samuel, I'll jump to you because that's very futurism. Let's talk about your work.
I mean, that sounds so great. How do I follow that? But I'm also actually working on my first ever narrative project, which is a queer opera set in a gay bar in Liverpool. It's a tragedy, which I'm very excited about.
A tragedy. Wow, I can't wait to see that. Monica, what about you? What are you working on?
Right now I'm working on the outreach campaign for Lupita so we can show the film in communities in Chiapas. And I'm also going back to editing a film I started in Guatemala around the same time I started Lupita about some survivors of a fire in a state-run youth center where 41 girls were burned at the hands of the state. And we've gone back and forth about how much information to give the audience and what kind of doc we want to make. But I think I just saw the film Love Song for Latasha last night. And I think I want to make something creative and so you can understand the situation from the survivors that are teenage girls now. So I'm going back into that.
Wow. I'm speechless. My goodness. Dia, what can we see next from you?
I'm producing 2 feature documentaries right now. One's called Girl Talk, and it's a 4-year longitudinal study about girls on a debate team outside of Boston and sort of about female voices and implicit bias. And the other is another Colorado-based project called The Holly about a former gang member who became a peace activist and shot someone at his own rally and the sort of machinations of government and police that were behind that particular incident. So, and they're both right now.
Where are y'all finding these stories? My God. These are truly documentary filmmakers in front of me. Wow, this is brilliant. I can't wait to see that, Dia. Samantha, why don't you end us off? What are you working on right now?
Sure. So I'm actually working on another short doc about hair. This one is a little more personal. It kind of is more uses my experience with my high school in upstate New York as a jumping off point. And it sort of is more of a personal look at using this hair rule as kind of like an example of these insidious types of racism that kind of exist and how they persist and how they kind of go unnoticed and unquestioned. So that's what I'm working on now.
Well, I'm excited to see everyone's project because y'all are all so cool and working on very cool projects. With that, we'll bring it to the end of this Q&A. Thank you all for attending today, not only at home, but also in this room, all the filmmakers here. And I hope you all have a lovely virtual festival and enjoy the rest of the films that are on the 2020 selection. Thank you all for being here again. This has been awesome.